I found a Doberman puppy buried in the snow. What happened next changed everything. The wind cut through Helena like a blade. The whole park lay buried in white, silent as a grave. I'm Jack Miller, caretaker of this playground, and I've cleared snow here for 20 winters. But that morning, something made my boots stop mid-step. A faint crack of metal, thin and lonely, echoed from beneath the red slide. I bent down, brushed away a crust of snow, and saw a small dark shape so small it could fit in my palm. At first, I thought it was a forgotten toy. Then it breathed. A Doberman puppy, no more than a month or two old. Black and tan fur was soaked and clinging to skin like wet silk. Its eyes were half-shut lashes, frozen white neck, scarred deep with the rough mark of a rope. The tiny body shivered, each spasm fighting off the stillness closing in. No whimper, no cry. Only a broken rhythm of air so faint I had to lean close to hear it. That breath was thin as smoke. I lifted it. The weight shocked me, barely a pound, maybe less. I could feel ribs under the sparse fur, sharp as wire. Its front legs were stiff as if they'd already given up believing in movement. Snow kept falling layer after layer, settling over its skin like the sky itself wanted to bury this secret. "No, little one," I whispered. My voice cracked and dry, the same voice that lost its echo after the wildfire years ago. I pulled my coat open, wrapped the small body inside, and pressed it against my chest. Its neck was ice against my skin, but somewhere under that frost, a heartbeat stumbled on slow, uneven but real. I crouched low, shielding it from the wind. Our footprints merged in the snow, one deep, one faint. I knew if I'd come minutes later, it would have been nothing but a frozen shape left behind. The wind howled. Children still laughed in the distance, their voices bright and careless as they slid down the hill. None of them knew that right beneath their laughter, something was dying. I looked back at the red slide, the place where it had been half buried, and the sight tore a hole through the white silence of winter. Nothing is more terrifying than life forgotten in a place meant for joy. I dropped to my knees, cupped it with both hands. My nails split and bled in the cold, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was keeping that breath from fading. Its eyes opened dark brown, clouded with frost, and looked at me. Not scared, not pleading, just looking as if asking, "Do you see me?" I swallowed hard. In that moment, I felt like I was staring into a mirror, a man who'd lost his voice holding a creature that could not make a sound. Both of us unseen by the world for far too long. Another gust swept past, burying everything again. I pulled the scarf tighter around its neck, pressed it close to my chest, and stood up. "It's okay," I murmured. "We're leaving. Both of us." I walked fast, breath turning to smoke, snow thickening with every step. Inside my coat, it didn't move, just trembled slightly with my rhythm. Every time my hand brushed its chest, I caught that tiny beat like a dying radio signal trying to send one last message: I'm still here. I held it tighter, almost covering it completely. Street light glow slid across its face, small, pale, nearly transparent. And I realized some beings don't need to cry for help. Their silence is loud enough to break a heart. Right then, I knew if it didn't make it, I'd never forgive myself. I bent closer and whispered, "Don't give up, Shadow." I didn't know why that name came out. It just felt right. From deep within the coat, I felt its fragile breath brush against my skin, weak, trembling, but alive. And there, in the 10 below cold of Montana, two broken souls were quietly learning how to live again. I pushed open the wooden cabin door, and warmth from the old stove spilled out like a sigh. The small house sat at the edge of the pine woods, only a few hundred meters from the park. I laid Shadow down on a blanket near the fire, my hands still wrapped around his fragile body, afraid that if I let go even for a second, life itself would slip away. Firelight flickered across his face, reflecting in those clouded eyes, and I realized something I had once been exactly where he was, only in a different way. 7 years ago, I was a firefighter for the Helena district. A wildfire west of town took my crew and my voice. A steel beam had collapsed, the heat pressing me into the dirt, and in that instant, smoke filled my throat. I woke up in a hospital bed to a doctor saying, "You lived, but your voice won't ever sound the same." Since then, I stopped teaching drills, stopped shouting commands, and stopped speaking to anyone but myself. The world around me went silent, as if sound itself had been switched off. I took a maintenance job at the park, the only work that let me stay close to the light without having to talk much. I thought I'd made peace with silence, until today. I opened the cabinet, poured warm water, dipped a towel, and began wiping the snow from Shadow's body. His fur stood up in shivers, twitching in short bursts. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I leaned close, catching only a faint rasp, uneven, broken. The skin around his neck was swollen and raw, marked deep as if something rough had cut into it. I touched gently. He flinched, then stopped, realizing I wasn't there to hurt him. I took the last of the warm milk, dipped my fingertip, and pressed it near his lips. Slowly. 1 drop, then 2. He licked weakly, barely moving, but that was enough. It meant he still wanted to live. I spoke softly. My voice cracked and gravelly. "It's all right, Shadow. You're safe now." The sound came out fractured thin as a snapped branch, but maybe for him it was enough. His tiny eyes blinked once, then closed. I watched him drift into sleep, his breathing still fragile, but steadier than before. I threw another log into the stove. The flame rose high, casting light on the cracked wood walls. Everything in this cabin was old. The chair, the guitar hanging on the wall, the photo of a smiling woman standing in the woods, my wife Laura. She died in that same fire while I was still in the hospital. I've kept the gray wool scarf she knitted for me that last winter. Faded rough, but it still smells faintly of pine and smoke. It was that scarf I wrapped around Shadow's neck when I found him. Maybe that's why I felt like I was holding a piece of the past I thought the fire had already taken. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows, snow hissing across the roof. I sat down on the floor, back to the stove, eyes fixed on the tiny body beside the flames. His small head rose and fell with every breath, weak but steady. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't completely silent. Another sound had joined mine, soft, alive, the sound of a creature breathing beside me. I remembered waking up in the hospital, the maddening silence, the way I screamed inside my own skull, but nothing came out. I knew what it was like not to call for help, not to be heard. I knew the fear in those small eyes because once I was that fear. I pulled the blanket higher over Shadow. His fur twitched under the spreading warmth. I pressed my palm to his chest. The faint rhythm was still there, fragile but fighting. I didn't need a bark. That heartbeat was enough to tell me he wasn't giving up. I smiled for the first time in years. "Let's learn how to speak again, Shadow." Firelight danced along the walls. I leaned back against the chair, eyelids heavy. Somewhere between waking and sleep, I heard the faintest sound, a thread of breath slipping past his throat. Not a bark, just a tiny gust of air, thin as a promise. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside that cabin, 2 beings who had lost their voices were quietly learning how to live through breath alone. The morning after the snowstorm, Helena lay under a thick veil of mist, dense as smoke. The wind had quieted, leaving only a slow creeping chill that slid through the cracks of the cabin walls. I woke when the first light touched the dark grain of the wood. In that silence, I heard something faint, the sound of paper brushing against itself. I looked up and saw Shadow trying to move. He was still weak, but alive. His once soaked black fur had dried into clumps, revealing pale pink skin beneath. His back legs trembled violently, fighting to lift that fragile frame off the floor. I sat on the ground, breathing carefully, afraid that even the air might break this fragile moment. Shadow raised his head, the morning light striking his clouded brown eyes. They blinked once, then rested on me. No bark, just a look still searching, asking whether this place was truly safe. I reached out my hand, palm open, slow and deliberate, as if relearning an old gesture. He hesitated, tilting his head, ears folding down. I waited. Every part of me was waiting. 1 second, 2. Then his nose brushed my hand, warm, shaking. A tiny spark ran through my spine. I let out a small breath and he flinched, then moved closer. That was the moment I knew he had chosen to trust. I gave him a soft towel to curl up beside the fire. He rested his head on the blanket, eyes half open, tracking every motion I made. I poured warm milk, held a spoon to his lips. At first, he only licked a little, uncertain. After a few drops, I saw his throat contract and a faint swallow escaped. Just a swallow, but in that cabin it sounded like a miracle. I smiled, voice rasped low. "Good job, Shadow, that's it." I didn't know if he understood, but his small ears twitched. I stayed still, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the crackle of firewood, the kind of quiet music I hadn't realized I'd missed. When he finished, he lay down again, but this time his head rested on my hand. Such a simple reflex, yet it melted something inside me. I sat there for a long time, watching his breath curl into the warm air. I remembered waking in the hospital all those years ago, tubes around my throat, a weight on my chest, unable to speak. When the doctor asked, "How do you feel?" all I could do was blink. No words, just a look. The same look Shadow gave me now, no voice, only the need to be seen. The light outside turned gold. I opened the door to let in the morning air. The wind carried pine resin wood smoke and the sweet, cold scent of melting snow. Shadow lifted his head instinctively, neck tilting, eyes narrowing at the brightness. I stood a few steps away and waved. "Come here, boy." He stared, uncertain, then took a step, small, wobbly, and another. Each one looked like walking on glass, but he kept coming. When he reached me, I knelt and placed my hand gently on his head. "That's it. You did it." He pressed himself against my leg, trembling but not pulling away. I could feel his warmth seeping through the fabric, reaching my heart. Outside, the snow was melting, revealing a dark patch of ground where I had found him the day before. I looked at that spot where something once buried was now breathing again in my arms. I whispered, "Tomorrow, we'll see the vet all right. Let's check that throat of yours." Shadow lifted his head, eyes faintly bright. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, a rhythm between two beings who didn't need sound. I cleaned up the stove, poured another cup of coffee. When I turned back, he was still watching me, head tilted, ears perked, studying every human motion like he was learning a new language. I chuckled softly, my voice rough. "Yeah, keep watching. You'll see this world isn't so bad after all." Light spilled across the floor, and our shadows merged, one tall, one small. A man who had lost his voice and a creature that had never used one. Two flickering outlines were trembling on the wooden boards, but both were alive. That was our first morning together. A day without words, without barking, just two breaths intertwining enough to know that the world was still listening. The second morning after I found him, the snow over Helena finally stopped. Weak sunlight slipped through a veil of mist, glinting off the ice like frosted glass. I wrapped Shadow in a wool blanket and draped my coat around him for good measure. His tiny head, tilted brown eyes flickering when they met the light, but his throat remained utterly silent. My old pickup shuddered as it came to life, exhaust puffing out like smoke from a winter stove. I set him gently on the passenger seat tucked tight beneath the layers of cloth. Each time the truck bounced, his body trembled, curling inward, as if the world might tilt away from him. I placed a hand on his chest, light steady to let him know I was still there. Morning in Helena was mercilessly cold. The main street was packed with snow-tire tracks cutting through in dark ribbons. When I turned onto Pine Ridge, the sign for Mason Veterinary Clinic appeared a wooden board glazed white with frost. I parked, opened the door, and the wind sliced my face like glass. "We're here." "Shadow," I rasped, voice breaking into breath. The glass door swung open, releasing the smell of disinfectant and cold metal. Dr. Mason's silver-hair-kind eyes, dulled by years, looked up from his desk. He smiled at first, weary but warm, until his gaze fell on the bundle in my arms. Then his expression hardened. "Good Lord, is he still breathing?" "Barely." I whispered. He motioned for me to place Shadow on the steel exam table. The overhead light spilled across his body, making him look impossibly small. Thin streams of vapor rose from his nose, fading before they reached the air above. Dr. Mason bent close, gloved hands tracing carefully across paw's belly throat. He inhaled sharply at the ring of scar tissue circling Shadow's neck, a deep, cracked band of red, like the mark of something that had once pulled too tight. "Jack," he said softly, "this isn't frostbite. That's a ligature burn, probably from plastic cord or rough rope. Someone tied him up. For a long time by the look of it. The larynx is swollen, and there's minor tearing in the soft tissue." I clenched my fists, the sound of latex brushing damp fur scraping through my head. The image of that tiny body beneath the red slide flashed again, silent, trembling, waiting for the end. "Doctor." Mason placed the stethoscope on his chest. The heart was weak, but steady. He nodded slowly. "We'll take an X-ray and a throat scope. I need to see whether there's permanent vocal damage." I nodded once. "As long as he lives." We moved carefully. When the machine hummed to life, Shadow flinched at the low vibration. I kept a hand on him, a silent promise that he wasn't alone. The screen began to bloom with the outline of delicate bones, thin as matchsticks, and a faint white band across his neck tracing the scar like a shadow of pain. Dr. Mason was quiet for a while. Then he said, "No fractures, no breaks, just swelling and scar buildup. But this little one, he may never bark again. Maybe just a whisper." I looked down at his eyes, open and steady under the scanner's light. He wasn't afraid, just tired. And I knew that feeling when the world speaks around you and you have nothing left to say back. "I used to think I didn't need my voice anymore," I murmured. "But seeing him, all I want is for him to say my name once." Dr. Mason's hand landed gently on my shoulder. "Jack, silence isn't always empty," he said. "Sometimes it's waiting for something worth breaking it." I didn't answer. I just watched as he cleaned the wound, wrapped a soft bandage, and gave a mild anti-inflammatory shot. Shadow flinched, but made no sound. When it was over, he tilted his head and pressed his nose against my wrist, small, fleeting, but it hit me straight in the heart. On the drive back, I laid him on the passenger seat again. The noon sun shimmered against the windshield, melting into the snow's glare. He slept, his head resting against my arm. I drove slowly, afraid to wake him, afraid that breath might vanish somewhere along the endless white road. When we reached the park gate, I glanced over. His eyes were open now, faint but calm, holding something new peace. "Trust. We'll learn to speak again, you and me," I whispered. He didn't respond, just exhaled a thin wisp of air, soft as a promise. And in the hum of the old truck engine, I heard something I thought I'd lost forever, a sound small but undeniable. The sound of life. 3 days after we came back from the clinic, the rooftops of Helena were still buried in white, but inside my cabin, something else was melting. The silence. Shadow. Slept a lot, ate little, but every breath he took was different now, steadier, longer. No longer the fragile, broken rhythm I'd heard beneath the red slide. Each morning I lit the stove, the scent of burning pine spreading through the small room. Firelight threw warm orange shapes across the wooden walls where my shadow and his wove together like two survivors. He liked to lie close to the hearth, his head resting on my boot, the white bandage Dr. Mason had wrapped still circling his throat. I left it there. Something about that scar felt sacred, a witness proof that he had fought to be heard even without a voice. On the 4th day, I decided he needed a real name. I tried a few in my head, Rusty Scout Jet, none of them fit. He looked at me with those deep brown eyes, calm, grounded. "No," I murmured. "You're not Jet, you're Shadow." His head, tilted ears lifted. In the glow of the fire, his eyes caught a flicker of amber. I smiled. "Yeah, that's it, Shadow. You're the shadow of the light, and the reason I keep it burning." From that moment, whenever I called, he would lift his head. No bark, just a look. But for me, that was enough. That afternoon, I set a bowl of water near the stove, then stepped back. He walked toward it, slowly, carefully, tiny steps across the creaking wood floor. His throat still wrapped, but I could hear the steady pulse of his breath. I didn't interfere, just watched. When he bent down, his legs quivered and his tail flicked once. A small motion, yet in that quiet house it was a symphony. I sat down and pulled my old guitar from the corner, the one I hadn't touched since the day my voice was taken. The strings were rusted, the body scarred, but the sound was still there. I strummed a slow chord. The low note hummed through the room, smoky and raw. Shadow looked up, ears pricked. He watched the guitar, then me tilting his head as if trying to understand. I played a few more notes softer this time. My throat was dry, but I whispered barely more than breath. "This is my voice. And maybe it's yours too." He crawled closer and touched his nose to my hand on the strings. A small click echoed as his claw brushed the wood, and I laughed, the first real laugh I'd made in years. Rough, broken, but real. That's when I realized I was speaking again. Just in another language. That evening, I cracked the window open. Cold air drifted in, carrying the smell of melting snow and distant wind. Shadow padded to the threshold and sat looking out. The yard lay before him, the same one he'd once been left in. But under the pale moonlight, it no longer looked cold. I knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. "Look," I said quietly, "we've found our way back to the light." He turned his head eyes, reflecting the fire behind us. In them I saw myself, not a rescuer, but the one being saved. That night, Shadow slept deeply, his head resting against my boot. I could hear his breathing, steady, warm. I'd never imagined something so small could fill a space that wide inside me. Before bed, I took a strip of leftover medical tape Dr. Mason had given me and wrote 2 simple words: Shadow, stay. I stuck it to the wall beside my wife's photo. Laura once told me love doesn't need a sound, it just needs to be seen. Maybe she was right. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the flicker of firelight. In that glow, 2 beings who had once lost their voices, one man, one dog, slept back to back in the middle of a Montana winter. The house was still old, the snow still falling, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of the silence. Because now, within that silence, there was the sound of breathing, the quiet rhythm of hope. The storm came without warning. That afternoon, Helena's skies were calm, but by sunset the wind was screaming through the pines like metal being dragged across stone. Clouds sank low, heavy, and black, and the snow thickened into layers. Inside the cabin, I fed the fire and tried to keep the warmth alive. Shadow lay by the stove, his head resting on my leg, breathing steadily. The swelling in his throat had gone down, though he still couldn't make a sound. I thought he was asleep until the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Only the wind outside remained whipping the door and the dying hiss of the fire. I reached for the flashlight. It slipped off the table. When I bent to grab it, I heard something else, the sound of air cutting through a gap. And emptiness. I turned. The spot where Shadow had been was empty. The blanket had been pushed aside and the front door had cracked open. I shot to my feet, heart pounding. Shadow, I rasped into the dark voice, tearing at the cold air. No answer. I grabbed my coat, wrapped the scarf tight, and ran outside. The wind hit like knives. Snow slashed across my eyes. The flashlight beam stretched short, weak, vanishing into the white. Then paw prints. Tiny ones, clear and straight, leading toward the park. I followed. Every step sank deep, the cold biting through my boots. The light flickered trees bending under the storm's breath. Ahead, the park gate loomed old wood, creaking against the wind. He had gone back, to where it all began. Under the red slide snow reached my knees. I swept the beam across the ground and stopped. A small shape was clawing at the snow with trembling legs. Shadow. He was shivering, the white bandage still wrapped around his neck, breath fogging the air in short bursts. I stumbled forward, dropped to my knees. Shadow. Oh God. But he didn't turn. His nose pressed into the snow, digging harder. I froze, then noticed something moving beneath the surface. I started digging too. My fingers went numb, skin splitting in the cold blood mixing with melted frost. Snow soaked through my sleeves, heavy and freezing. Then the beam caught something, a tiny, curled shape. A puppy. Pale, yellow fur, nearly frozen stiff. Shadow stopped clawing and pressed his muzzle into the snow, touching that fragile body. No bark, no cry. Just a low, broken exhale, rough, uneven, but sound. His first sound. I cleared the rest of the snow, lifted the limp little body into my arms. It didn't move. I placed a hand over its chest, faint, almost gone. Shadow moved closer, set his nose against the pup's ribs and breathed steadily, as if trying to warm it with his own life. "Dear God," I whispered, shaking. "You're trying to save it." I gathered them both into my coat and ran. The wind tore at us, and the flashlight went dark. I followed instinct, the outline of the fence, the faint slope of the hill, until the cabin's golden light appeared ahead, a flicker in the storm. Inside, I laid the smaller puppy on a rug near the fire, wrapped it in cloth, then pulled Shadow close beside it. Both were trembling uncontrollably. I threw more logs into the stove. Flames roared back to life, chasing the cold from the walls. Shadow didn't move away. His eyes stayed fixed on the tiny creature, touching its wet fur, licking it softly. Then the smallest body shuddered and a weak breath escaped. Once, twice. Shadow closed his eyes, head resting on my shoulder, his throat trembling. A sound came low, cracked, not a bark. Not clear, but real. I heard it, and tears fell. "Good boy, Shadow," I whispered, voice rough and breaking. "You found your voice again." I looked at them both by the fire, one small Doberman who had once been left to die, and another soul pulled back from the storm. And I understood silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the space waiting to be filled with kindness. Outside, the blizzard still howled. But inside that wooden cabin in Montana, two fragile lives breathed together, one hoarse, one faint, blending into the first music of survival. I pressed my hand over my heart. It beat in rhythm with theirs. The morning after the storm was strangely bright. The sun over Helena struck the snow, scattering into 1,000 shards of light that glittered like glass. The wind was gone now, only the smell of wet pine and faint wood smoke lingered in the air. I sat by the stove. Shadow rested at my feet, and in my hands, curled like a heartbeat, was Willow, the golden-furred puppy he had pulled from the storm. The whole cabin glowed with the warmth of life. Shadow still didn't bark, but for the first time I saw his throat tremble softly with his breath, not from pain, but from peace. He licked the back of my hand, then looked at Willow. That small gesture said everything. He knew what he had done. I wrapped scarves around both of them and called Dr. Mason. His voice lifted with joy when he heard the news. "I told you, Jack," he laughed. "That boy doesn't need a voice to be heard. He makes the whole world stop and listen." I laughed too, a broken, raspy laugh, but this time it didn't hurt. It was the sound of someone learning how to breathe again. By afternoon, the snow was melting fast. I saw a car stop by the park gate and a boy came running. Noah, maybe 7 years old, clutching a damp flyer. His mother, Sarah, followed close behind. When she saw Willow in my arms, her eyes widened and filled. The boy dropped to his knees without a word, cupping the tiny dog's face in his hands. Willow blinked, wagged her tail once, then pressed into his chest. The park fell silent. Sarah looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "We've been searching for 2 days," she whispered. "I thought she was gone." "Who saved her?" I pointed beside me. Shadow stood there, head tilted, tail moving in slow arcs. She knelt and brushed a hand over his head. "Thank you, sweet boy." Noah looked at him, eyes wide and pure. "Thank you, little hero." Shadow lifted his head. His throat quivered. A sound broke free, hoarse, cracked, fragile, but real. His first bark. Sarah hugged her son, and I just stood there, heart pounding. The bark was small, but it echoed across the snow like a declaration life had won. I knelt and whispered, "Good boy, Shadow. You found your voice." Noah smiled, eyes shining. "Can I come back and play with him sometime?" "Of course," I said. "This park belongs to both of them." When they left, Shadow watched them go. Willow turned once, giving a soft whine light as wind. I saw Shadow's shoulders tremble. Then he looked up at me, eyes deep, asking, "Now what?" I placed my hand on his head. "Now we live," I said, "the way we were meant to." Evening came. We walked the trail between the pines, snow crunching beneath our boots. Overhead, the sky opened in bands of pink and amber, the kind of light that only comes after a storm. I stopped staring at the red slide in the park, the place where he had once lain silent beneath the snow. Now only sunlight and meltwater remained. I spoke softly, voice rough but sure. "We don't come back to remember the pain, Shadow. We come back to prove we survived it." He sat beside me, resting his head against my knee. We stayed there listening to water drip from the slide's edge, the sound of snow learning to let go. I realized then that some things don't need words to be understood. A look, a breath, a bit of trust, that's enough to mend 2 broken lives. When the sun finally dipped, we returned to the cabin. I brewed coffee. He curled beside the stove. Outside, snow still drifted down slow, soft like a promise. I opened my small notebook and wrote the final line. "It wasn't me who saved him. He's the one who taught me that silence can speak." I closed the book, leaned down, and whispered, "Sleep, Shadow. Tomorrow we've got more work to do." He curled up tighter, breathing steadily. Warmth filled the room. Outside the window, Helena lay quiet, but within that silence one truth rang louder than any sound. Kindness still exists, and it always finds its way home.